Colonel Voss's voice came over the channel twice with specific instructions that her people followed immediately and without question. The withdrawing Dravathi units were not destroyed where they could be safely let go. They were directed gently and with weapons toward extraction corridors that the humans had already identified and, I suspect, specifically left open. Because the fastest way to end a ground engagement is to give the enemy a way out that they will take, and the humans wanted this to end cleanly. That, I later learned, was deliberate. It was not mercy in the soft sense, it was efficiency. A retreating enemy stops being a problem, Sergeant Fenaruda told me later. An enemy you back into a corner starts calculating what they have to lose. By hour 10, the last Dravathi ground unit had lifted off from Veldran soil. By hour 12, the orbital signals had gone quiet in a way that meant the Dravathi fleet had transited out, and the 31 human ships were still up there, battered and hull-scored and magnificent, circling a planet that was still standing. Thal Auric came out of the command shelter looking like a man who had not slept in 2 days and had strong feelings about it. He found me in the transit plaza. He stood beside me and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "They held." "Yes," I said. 31 ships. "Yes." He was quiet again, then with the particular tone of a man working through math that does not add up and has given up expecting it to. "How?" I thought about Fenaruda and her bandage and her explanation. I thought about the human standing in a plaza in front of 2 armored crawlers not moving. I thought about Colonel Marin Voss saying enough, in a voice that was not boastful or theatrical but simply true in the way that facts are true. "I think," I said slowly, "that they decided it was going to work and then they made it work." Thal looked at me. "That is not a satisfying military analysis," he said. "No," I agreed, "but I think it is the correct one." Colonel Marin Voss came down to the surface the next morning, after her medics had done their work and her people had rested whatever small amount soldiers rest after engagements like that. She was shorter than I expected. Human officers in my imagination had been larger, more dramatic, more like the weapons she commanded. She was ordinary looking in the way that genuinely dangerous things are often ordinary looking. She met Thal Auric in the central square, which still smelled of smoke and had a large piece of Dravathi crawler sitting in it that nobody had moved yet. They shook hands, a human custom. Thal had looked it up before the meeting and performed it carefully. "Your people held well," Voss said. "Your people fell from the sky," Thal said. She smiled at that. Small, flat, real. "We do that." "Why?" The word came out before Thal could stop it, carrying 7 hours of siege and the memory of that pause in his voice when he had told us that nobody was coming. "You did not have to respond. We are not in your territory. We are not your people. 900 Dravathi warships, 31 of yours. Why?" Voss looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the ruined plaza, the smoke-stained walls, the shelter entrances where civilians were beginning, carefully and still frightened, to emerge into the damaged light. "Because you sent a distress signal," she said, "and we received it." She said it like that was the complete explanation, like cause and effect were simply that direct, like there was no possible universe where receiving a distress call led to any outcome other than responding to it. I have thought about that answer many times since. I have turned it over, looking for the political calculation inside it, the strategic interest, the angle, because that is how the galaxy works. That is what every species I have ever known does. Everything has an angle. I have not found one yet. Maybe there is not one. Maybe Marin Voss meant exactly what she said, simply and flatly, the way she said most things. Maybe humans are, in this one specific way, exactly as straightforward as they appear. Or maybe I think sometimes the angle is longer than I can see. Maybe humans are playing a game whose board I have not been shown yet, and the pieces are called things like trust and obligation and the kind of species you want to be in a galaxy that remembers. I do not know. I am a tactical observer. I observe tactics. Questions about the nature of humanity are somewhat above my pay grade. What I know is this: 17,000 Keth civilians on Veldran are alive today. The Dravathi left. 31 human ships went home carrying wounded and hull damage and, I hope, some knowledge that what they did was seen and understood and will not be forgotten. My name is Vora Selkanai. I watched the humans fall from the sky, and I will tell you without exaggeration, without metaphor, and without any of the editorial embellishment that I was specifically told by my unit commander to avoid in official reports, that it was the most terrifying, most improbable, most unreasonably effective thing I have ever witnessed in my entire military career. We were bracing for death. They had other plans for us. The next time someone tells me that humans are the most confused species in any given room, I am going to smile politely, and I am going to think about a woman in a transit plaza, standing in front of two armored crawlers, raising her weapon with the calm of someone choosing how to spend a mild afternoon, and I am going to say nothing, because some things do not translate. Some things you simply have to survive to understand. My name is Vora Selkani, third-rank tactical observer of the Keth Collective, and I am writing this account because, honestly, if I do not write it down, nobody is going to believe a single word that comes out of my mouth, not even my own mother. And she once believed me when I told her our neighbor had taught his pet lizard bird to recite military codes, so that tells you something about how unbelievable this story actually is. Let me start from the beginning, because the beginning matters. The beginning is where the hope was, right before it got completely, brutally, spectacularly crushed. We had been stationed on Veldran, the fourth colony world of the Keth Collective, for approximately 60 rotations. 60 rotations of border patrol, resource monitoring, and the exciting daily task of watching absolutely nothing happen on a planet that smelled faintly of boiled sulfur and old regret. My commanding officer, Senior Warden Thal Orek, had spent 40 of those rotations growing increasingly convinced that the Dravathi Empire was massing forces just beyond the outer sensor ring. Nobody believed Thal. We liked Thal, but nobody believed him. Then the Dravathi arrived. And I will tell you something about the Dravathi Empire. They do not knock. They do not send polite messages. They do not negotiate. What they do is show up with approximately 900 warships, drop out of transit space directly above your atmosphere, and begin orbital bombardment before you have even had the chance to finish your breakfast. I had not finished my breakfast. I want to be very clear about that. My meal ration was still warm. The first salvo hit the outer defense towers at sunrise. I remember watching the explosion columns rise above the ridgeline from the observation deck and thinking, in that very calm, very stupid way the brain works when it refuses to accept what the eyes are seeing, oh, Thal was right. Then the second salvo hit closer, and I stopped thinking calm thoughts entirely. The colony held 17,000 Keth civilians, farmers, engineers, families, children who had grown up on this sulfur-smelling rock and called it home. We had 2 full battalions of ground defenders, 4 atmospheric interceptor wings, and a defense grid that had not been updated in 12 rotations because the Collective Council kept redirecting the budget to something called diplomatic infrastructure, which, as far as I could tell, meant very expensive furniture for people who were not currently being bombed. Against 900 Dravathi warships, none of that meant anything. It meant less than nothing. It meant that we could put up a fight for a little while, delay the inevitable long enough to feel it properly, and then die knowing exactly how outmatched we were, which is, I would argue, the worst possible way to lose. Thal Orek called the emergency rally on every channel simultaneously. His voice was steady. I have always admired that about Thal. The man could sound steady during a cave-in. All units to defensive positions, civilians to the underground shelters. Communications team, send the distress signal on all collective frequencies repeated every 30 seconds. Do not stop sending it. Then he paused, just briefly, just enough. And prepare yourselves. That pause said everything the words did not. That pause said, I do not think anyone is coming. That pause said, I am sorry. That pause said, eat your breakfast if you have one because this may be the last chance. My meal ration had gone cold by then. I ate it anyway. The next 6 hours were what military historians sitting very safely far away from actual military situations like to call a sustained defensive engagement. What it actually was a nightmare. The Dravathi ground forces dropped in behind their orbital support, armored units the size of buildings rolling across the flatlands toward the colony perimeter. Their infantry moved in coordinated formations, each soldier in environmental armor that shrugged off our standard-issue pulse rounds like they were mildly inconvenient rainfall. We held the eastern perimeter for 2 hours. We lost it in 4 minutes when a Dravathi heavy crawler drove straight through the barrier wall like it was made of dried clay. We held the northern ridge for 90 minutes. Then an orbital strike removed the northern ridge from the conversation entirely. The southern evacuation corridor, which was supposed to get civilians to the deep shelters, came under air attack at the 40-minute mark. We rerouted. Then that route got hit. We rerouted again. Then Warden Keela Foss, who was coordinating the evacuation personally, took a direct hit from a Dravathi scatterburst round, and for 30 seconds nobody was coordinating anything, and those 30 seconds cost us. I do not like to think about those 30 seconds. By hour 6 we had pulled back to the inner colony ring. 3/4 of the civilians were in shelters. The rest were still moving through corridors that were increasingly becoming not corridors but smoking rubble with hopeful intentions. We had lost 40% of our ground defenders. Both interceptor wings had been stripped from the sky in the first 2 hours. The defense grid was running on backup power because the main generators had been targeted specifically and destroyed methodically, because the Dravathi are nothing if not organized about their destruction. Thal Auric found me crouched behind a collapsed transit station wall trying to recalibrate a sensor relay with hands that would not stop shaking. Vora. His voice was quiet now. Not the broadcast voice, the real voice. Sir, the distress signal has been transmitting for 5 hours. I looked up at him. Has anyone responded? He was quiet for a moment. Around us, the sounds of battle were constant and close. The air smelled of burning metal and something sharp that I did not want to identify. We received one response, he said. From the collective command at Sector Hub 12. They acknowledged the signal. Another pause. They said they were assessing the situation. I stared at him. Assessing, I said. Yes, we are being bombed into paste and they are assessing. That appears to be the case. I went back to the sensor relay. Not because it mattered particularly, but because my hands needed something to do that was not shaking uselessly. Then Thal said something else. Quietly. Almost to himself. But I heard it. There was a second response. On the emergency band. Not from any collective frequency. I stopped. Who? A designation I do not recognize. UNEF. United Nations Expeditionary Forces. He frowned at his comm unit. They asked for our exact coordinates, our civilian count, and the number of enemy units in orbit. What did you tell them? Everything they asked. He looked up at the sky, which by this point was less a sky and more an ongoing argument between fire and gravity. I do not know who they are. I do not know if they can do anything, but they responded. And right now that is more than anyone else has done. He said it without much hope. I heard the lack of hope clearly. It was not the voice of a man expecting rescue. It was the voice of a man telling himself a small story to get through the next 10 minutes. We held for another hour, then another half. We lost the transit station entirely and pulled back to the shelter district. The Dravathi were inside the colony perimeter now, and the fighting was close, personal, and going very badly in our direction. At hour 7 and 20 minutes, Thal's comm unit chimed. The voice on the other end was strange. The translator struggled with it for a second, clipping and reformatting before settling into something comprehensible. It was clipped, flat, quick, efficient in a way that felt almost aggressive. Keth Collective Forces, this is Colonel Marin Voss, UNF 3rd Orbital Drop Division. We have your coordinates locked. We have the enemy orbital positions mapped. We are beginning final approach. Civilians need to be away from open ground. I repeat, civilians away from open ground. You have 8 minutes. Thal stared at his comm. 8 minutes for what? The voice did not answer that. The channel had already closed. I want to tell you that those 8 minutes felt hopeful, that we rallied, that courage surged through us like something warm and golden. That is what happens in stories when rescue arrives. The hopeful music swells. Everyone straightens up. What actually happened is that we had no idea what we were waiting for. The Dravathi kept attacking because they had not received the hopeful memo. We lost another defensive line in minute 3, and by minute 6 most of us had privately concluded that the UNEF, whoever they were, had miscalculated something and were not actually coming. By minute 7 we were bracing for the next advance. By minute 7 and 50 seconds the sky cracked. I do not have a better word for it. It cracked. Like something heavy had been dropped onto it from above. There was a sound, low and enormous, that I felt in my back teeth and my chest simultaneously. Then multiple sounds like that. Overlapping, building, and then the light. Dozens, no, I counted later, and it was over 80. Entry trails burning through the atmosphere at angles that seemed far too steep to be anything other than intentional. Bright, extremely bright. The Dravathi anti-air batteries swung upward and opened fire immediately, which tells you that even they were not prepared for it, because they were still configured for ground suppression. Several of the entry trails winked out. I will not pretend otherwise. The Dravathi shot some of them down, and I understood in that moment that the humans inside those ones were simply gone, and I felt something heavy and cold settle in my chest that I am not sure I have entirely put down since, but not all of them, not most of them. The pods hit the ground in a ring around the Dravathi ground force perimeter. The impacts shook the earth, and then the pods opened, and the humans came out. I had heard of humans. Most of the collective had heard of humans, the way you hear about something distant and slightly odd. a species that had joined the galactic community fairly recently, that were smaller than most, that had a reputation for being difficult to predict. There was a joke in the collective military that humans were either the most dangerous thing in a room or the most confused thing in a room, and the trouble was you could not always tell which until it was too late. I understand that joke now. The human soldiers came out of those pods moving fast. Not cautiously, not in measured, calculated tactical steps. Fast, like something had been keeping them still for too long and they were very, very unhappy about it. They were in armor I did not recognize, dark and angular, carrying weapons that were already firing before some of them had fully cleared the pod hatches. They fanned outward in patterns that made sense to them and possibly to nobody else, which somehow made it more effective because the Dravathi ground commanders were clearly expecting a conventional approach and getting something else entirely. I heard one human very close to my position shout something to two others in their own language that the translator rendered, somewhat tentatively, as a phrase of extreme enthusiasm combined with an instruction to move to the left. They moved to the left. The Dravathi position on the left ceased to exist approximately 4 seconds later. From my collapsed wall, with the sensor relay forgotten in my hands and my cold meal ration a distant memory, I watched the battle shift. It did not shift slowly. It shifted the way a table shifts when someone flips it, sudden, total, complete. But above us in orbit the larger question was still being answered, because 900 Dravathi warships were still up there, and I did not know how many human ships had come. I did not know if there were any human ships at all, or if the drop pods had been launched from something tiny and inadequate that was already burning. Thal Auric was on the comm trying to reach Colonel Marin Voss. The channel crackled. Then her voice came back, sharp and immediate, and in the background behind her voice were sounds that I recognized as a ship under fire. Hull impacts, alarms, the controlled noise of a bridge that is having a very intense time. Colonel Voss, Thal said, the ground engagement has changed. But your ships, what is the status of your ships? A brief pause, the sound of something hitting the hull. Admiral Dak Reyes has that handled, she said. How many ships do you have? Thal asked. Another pause, shorter this time. Enough, she said. And the way she said it was not boastful. It was not theatrical. It was very quiet and very flat, and somehow that made it the most terrifying thing I had heard all day. She closed the channel again. On the ground below me, a human soldier ran past my position at a speed that seemed biologically unreasonable, turned a corner and disappeared into the smoke of what had been a Dravathi armored column. I heard from that direction a very large explosion, followed by silence, followed by the human shouting something that the translator rendered as a phrase of extreme satisfaction. I sat behind my wall, sensor relay still in my hands, and thought, quite sincerely and without any irony whatsoever, that I did not fully understand what was happening. But I understood that the Dravathi had come here to end us, and something had arrived to disagree. And whatever happened in orbit, whatever Admiral Dak Reyes was doing up there with his unspecified number of human ships against 900 Dravathi warships, the humans on the ground were not behaving like people who expected to lose. That, I decided, was either very reassuring or very, very concerning. I would find out which in the hours to come. I want to tell you something about the nature of hope. Hope, when it arrives after a very long absence, does not feel warm and golden the way stories describe it. It feels suspicious. It feels like a trick. It feels like your brain saying, yes, but what if this good thing is actually just the setup for a worse thing? Because your brain has been through a lot today and it is not ready to commit to optimism. That was precisely where I was emotionally, crouched behind my collapsed wall, watching humans sprint through smoke in directions that did not follow any tactical manual I had ever studied. The Dravathi ground forces were in trouble. I could see that. What had been a controlled, methodical encirclement of the colony inner ring had become something considerably less controlled and considerably less methodical. The human drop soldiers were everywhere, not in the sense that they had superior numbers, because they did not, but in the sense that they kept appearing where the Dravathi did not expect them and doing things the Dravathi had not prepared for, and then moving before the response could land. I watched one human, a tall one in armor with a dent in the left shoulder that suggested a very close encounter with something large, coordinate 3 other soldiers through a Dravathi supply line without once slowing down. They hit it from 2 sides in a direction that I was fairly certain was technically from underneath, by which I mean they had used a collapsed drainage channel that should not have been on any map and was definitely not on mine. The Dravathi supply line stopped being a supply line. The humans were already gone before the explosion fully settled. From somewhere to my right, Warden Keela Foss, who was alive and functional despite my earlier fears, because the scatterburst round had taken out her comm unit and most of her outer armor plating but apparently had not gotten around to stopping her personally, appeared at a low run. Vora. She dropped beside me, breathing hard. Her armor was blackened down the entire right side. Status? Perimeter is fragmenting in the Dravathi favor, I said, and then corrected myself immediately. Was fragmenting, it is now fragmenting in a different direction. She looked at the smoke columns to the east where a human fire team had just removed a Dravathi heavy armor position from the tactical board. Who are they? Humans. She stared at me. I understood that. I meant who specifically? What unit? What authority? Why are they here? Colonel Marin Voss, UNEF 3rd Orbital Drop Division, I said, which was everything I knew. They responded to our distress signal. Keela was quiet for a moment, watching a human soldier vault over a barricade with the kind of physical confidence that suggested either extreme competence or a complete absence of self-preservation instinct. I had been unable to determine which category applied to humans in general. The collective did not send them? She asked. The collective sent us a message saying they were assessing the situation. Another pause. Right, said Keela. And in that one word was the entire complicated history of how the Keth collective treated its outer colony worlds, which is a long and frustrating history that I will not go into here because we were actively being invaded and there were more immediate concerns. Above us, something large and bright moved across the sky. Not a Dravathi warship. The profile was wrong, the running lights were wrong, everything about it was wrong for Dravathi, which meant it was a human vessel, and it was close enough to the upper atmosphere that I could see the hull scoring from weapons fire, long black streaks across what I assumed was once a cleaner surface. It was also still moving, still maneuvering, still very much in the fight. My comm crackled. Thalorek's voice from the central command shelter. All ground units be aware. Orbital engagement is ongoing. Human fleet is... He stopped. Restarted. Human fleet is engaging the Dravathi formation. Admiral Reyes has requested we keep all available sensors pointed upward and relay any targeting data we can pull. How many ships does Admiral Reyes have? Kayla asked on the channel. A pause that felt heavy. 31, said Thal. Silence on the channel. 31 ships, against 900. I did not know the specifications of human warships. I did not know their weapons, their shielding, their tactical doctrines, their range, their speed, their any of it. But I knew the number 900, and I knew the number 31, and the distance between those two numbers was not a gap that specifications typically closed. They are insane, Kayla said. Not with contempt, with something closer to awe and slight horror combined. That is one interpretation, I said. On the ground, the situation kept evolving in ways that the Dravathi ground commanders were clearly finding upsetting. I could tell they were finding it upsetting because their formation patterns kept changing, which is what a ground force does when things are not proceeding according to plan and they need to adapt quickly. But adapting quickly requires knowing what you are adapting to, and what you are adapting to is a group of humans who appeared to collectively regard tactical predictability as a personal insult. I saw one human fire team split into individual soldiers and disappear into the ruins of the colony market district, each one moving in a direction that had nothing to do with the others. My brain tried to find the pattern. My brain failed. Then, approximately 90 seconds later, those same soldiers converged on a Dravathi command unit from 5 separate angles at the same moment, and the command unit stopped being a command unit. How did they coordinate that without continuous comm traffic? I do not know. I still do not know. I have asked several humans about this since, and they look at me with expressions that suggest the answer is obvious, and then they describe something involving timing and trust and what one human soldier later called just knowing where your people are going to be, which is not a satisfying technical explanation. Keela grabbed my arm. Look, I looked. To the north, 2 Dravathi armored crawlers, the enormous kind that had driven through our barrier walls earlier like they were decorative, were moving toward the central shelter district. Directly toward the shelters where most of our civilians were, and between them and the shelters, standing in what used to be the northern transit plaza, was a single human soldier, in dark armor with shoulder markings I did not know how to read, standing in the middle of an open plaza with 2 armored crawlers heading toward her at full advance speed. She needs to move, Keela said urgently. The human did not move. She needs to move right now, Keela said, louder, as though volume would help. The human still did not move. She raised something large that she had been carrying on her back, settled it against her shoulder, and appeared, from this distance, to be looking down a targeting scope with the focused calm of someone who had done this before and found it only mildly interesting. The first crawler was 100 meters out, then 80, then 60. The human fired twice. Now, I want to be accurate here because accuracy matters. The weapon she was carrying was a man-portable anti-armor system, a class of weapon that exists in most military inventories for dealing with armored vehicles but typically requires the shooter to be at a safe distance because the blast radius is considerable. She was not at a safe distance. Both crawlers stopped permanently with a great deal of fire and noise. The shockwave from the second one knocked the human off her feet entirely, sent her skidding across the transit plaza stones, and deposited her behind a decorative fountain that was now significantly less decorative. She lay still for 3 seconds. My heart did something uncomfortable. Then she got up, picked up the weapon, checked something on it, and walked at a steady pace with only a slight favor on her left leg, toward the next Dravathi position. Keela made a sound. I am not sure how to spell it. It was somewhere between disbelief and respect and a mild prayer. I want to be on their side in every future conflict, she said quietly. Every single one, whatever they are fighting, I want to be standing next to them. Right now we are technically both on the same side, I pointed out. I am aware. I am making a long-term statement. In the hour that followed, the ground battle reached what military historians would later call, in their comfortable chairs far from the sulfur smell of Veldran, a decisive turning point. What it actually was an hour of absolute noise, confusion, fire, and human soldiers doing things that made experienced Keth military observers question everything they thought they understood about engagement tactics. The humans did not hold lines, they did not dig in and defend. They moved, constantly, fluidly, pressing into gaps, creating problems that the Dravathi had to respond to, and then being somewhere else by the time the response arrived. They were not reckless. There is a difference between reckless and fearless, and I learned that difference watching them work. They made calculated choices, but their calculations included tolerances for risk that were simply different from anything the Keth military trained for. One human sergeant, a stocky person named Fen Aruda, whose name I learned later because she introduced herself while bandaging a wound on my arm that I had not noticed receiving, explained it to me during a brief lull between engagements. The goal is to be where they don't want you to be, she said, tightening the bandage with a practiced efficiency that suggested this was approximately the 15th wound she had treated today, and she had a system. You don't win by being safer than the enemy. You win by being more inconvenient than the enemy is prepared to deal with. More inconvenient, I repeated. Right. Make their day complicated enough that they stop thinking about their objective and start thinking about you. She finished the bandage, patted my arm once, and stood up. Works every time. Then she went back into the smoke because there was more inconveniencing to do. Above us, the orbital battle was producing lights across the sky that my brain kept trying to categorize as beautiful and my survival instincts kept correctly identifying as explosions. Thalorek was relaying targeting data to Admiral Reyes's fleet as fast as our battered sensor systems could pull it, and we were getting fragments of information back through the UNF tactical channel, pieces of a picture that I could not fully assemble. What I could assemble from those fragments was this. The 31 human ships were not fighting the Dravathi fleet conventionally, they were not forming a battle line, they were not engaging the main formation. They had split somehow into groups that were never where the Dravathi aimed. Always moving, always pressing on the points that hurt most, the communication ships, the fuel carriers, the command vessels. Every move designed to be specifically the worst possible thing for the Dravathi at that exact moment, like the ground troops, exactly like the ground troops, more inconvenient than the enemy was prepared to deal with. The Dravathi had 900 ships, but a fleet of 900 ships is only as effective as its ability to coordinate, to communicate, to resupply, to follow orders from commanders who are still alive and still in command. And the humans were systematically, patiently, and with what I can only describe as surgical aggression, removing each of those capabilities one at a time. At hour 9 of the assault on Veldran, the Dravathi ground force received a signal from their orbital command. I did not know this at the time. I found out later in the debriefs when Dravathi commanders who had survived the engagement were questioned. The signal told them to begin consolidating for extraction, not retreat. The Dravathi do not use that word. But consolidating for extraction is the operational equivalent, just with better vocabulary. The ground force began pulling back. I watched them go from the transit plaza, standing beside Keela, both of us too tired to speak. The humans tracked the withdrawal carefully, pressing where pressure helped and holding back where pressure would only cost lives unnecessarily.